Welcome back, YouTube. I'm Sharita with SC4Crochet, and today we're making the Loopy Crochet Ultra Crop. I'm going to be using the Big Twist Value yarn in the color Soft Purple, and you're going to need 3 skeins of this yarn for the project. So grab your hooks, let's get going. The hook I'm using for this project is going to be my eye hook, that's the 5.5 millimeter. Part 1 I'm calling the cuff. This is the wrist portion of the sleeve. Row 1 is going to be 18 foundation half double crochets. You can certainly do chains and then do 18 half double crochets into your chain, but I prefer foundation rows. Throughout this tutorial, I try to skip through to save a little time, so I'm showing you a couple of the stitches, but you can feel free to pause the video, work on yours, and then meet me back when you have your row complete. And this is what it looks like when my 18 stitches are complete. I cannot stress the importance of counting enough. It can make or break your project if you have a stitch off. So you're going to see me counting throughout this tutorial. I'm going to chain 1 and turn at the end of each of the rows for my cuff because I want to keep the edge nice and tight. You can certainly chain 2 and turn if you feel more comfortable with that. Row 2 is just 18 half double crochets in the back loop. So you can see I'm not pulling through both loops of the stitch. I'm just going into the back loop. All right, we're going to do the same thing we did in row 2 for rows 3 through 14. So meet me back there. All right, that's the end of row 14. And you see here, I'm even counting my rows just to make sure I'm in the right place. Showing you my measurements just in case you want to alter this for yourself. My 18 stitches across ended up being 5 inches. And my 14 rows was about 7 inches wide. So I chained 1 and turned just like I'm getting ready to start another row, and I'm going to seam this together in order to create my cuff. Be mindful of that first stitch on your foundation row. Sometimes that can be confusing and it looks like a stitch, but you want to make sure that you find those 2 bars so you can make sure you're going into the right stitch. I'm going to seam these together with the slip stitch. I'm going into the back loop of row 14 and through both loops of the foundation row. So you'll see that again into the back loop of the row that I was on, and then in through both loops of that foundation row that I'm going into. And this is a slip stitch. All right, so my seam looks a little bulky on this side, but this is the wrong side. So we're gonna flip this cuff inside out. And now you can see we were able to maintain the ribbing effect even with that seam on there. All right, so for the next part, we're gonna start working along the edge of this cuff. It's important to note where your seam is because that seam does not count as a stitch. Part 2 is the loopy portion of our sleeve. I'm chaining up 2 just to get to the next row. The stitch that I wanna go into is this ridge from the rows that we created with the rib stitch. And I'm choosing to go in there instead of going just into the side so that I don't create any excess spacing. What I'm going to do is put 2 of our double crochet loop stitches into each of these stitches on the ridge. Now you can watch me do this double crochet loop stitch, but I'm also going to include the link that you can get to my last video where I gave instructions on how to do this stitch. Since we had 14 rows on our cuff and we're putting 2 stitches at the top of each of these rows, we should finish with 28 of these double crochet loop stitches. And this may be unnecessary, but I'm just showing you how I flip my work to the other side so that I can pinpoint where the ridge is that's on the other side. Because one rib is on the inside and one rib is on the outside for the next row. So you'll have to make sure that you're going into the right stitch. All right, skipping forward, I'm at the last few stitches of that first row, just finishing that off. And again, I go back and count just to make sure. You want to skip that chain 2, that does not count as a stitch, but we want to make sure that we count off the stitches to make sure that we have 28 of those double crochet loops. And once I verify my 28 stitches, I'm going to close this row by slip stitching into our first double crochet loop. So again, skip that chain 2 and slip stitch into our first double crochet loop in order to close. So we doubled our stitches in row 1. We're going to do another increase in row 2. When you chain up 2 to the next row, you want to make sure you go right back into that same stitch because we're not counting that chain 2 as a stitch. On this row, we're going to do 1 double crochet loop in the first stitch and then 2 double crochet loops in the next stitch. And just repeat that around. 1 in this stitch, 2 in the next. And because we're still increasing, but we're not doubling, our stitch count for this row should be 42 stitches. And we're going to slip stitch to join this row as well, and then verify our count before moving forward to the next row. All right, so for row 3, we are going to chain up 2 as normal, and we're only going to put 1 double crochet loop in each stitch. So no increase on this one. This is just 42 stitches, 42 double crochet loops all the way around, and then slip stitching back into our first double crochet loop in order to close the row. So just showing you a little bit of a fit check so that you can visualize where we're going with this as far as how the cuff goes up my arm. And then also just so you see that the cuff does have some stretch to it with that rib stitch. my arm actually ends up being 8 inches around, but that cuff, remember when I first measured, was only 7 inches. We're going to repeat row 3 for rows 4 through 18. So that's the end of part 2. This gets the sleeve probably a little ways past the elbow, but now we need to open the sleeve up in order to start part 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically repeating row 3 with the 42 double crochet loop stitches, but the only difference on row 19 is that we are not going to slip stitch at the end to join the row. So that's my last stitch of row 19. I'm not going to slip stitch. I'm going to chain 1 and cut my yarn and then weave in that tail. So we are going to do this for the rest of the sleeve. Because that double crochet loop stitch can only be worked in one direction, we can't just chain up and turn our work. So we do have to end it this way, but this stitch is fast to work up. So this is going to be the easiest way to get this sleeve done. I'm going to weave in my tail on each of these rows, and I just do this with my hook. You can certainly grab a needle and weave it through, but I find that I can weave it through backwards and I can still come back on the next row and stitch over top of the tail. For rows 20 through 32, we're going to repeat row 19. You just have to reattach your yarn and chain up 2. Don't count that chain 2 as a stitch, so go right back into that same stitch for your first double crochet loop stitch. But we're going to do 42 of those double crochet loops around, and then we're not going to join at the end. We're just going to tie off our yarn. I'm going to come back at the end of this row just to show you what it looks like when I stitch back over my tail from my previous row. And here I'm working my way towards the end of that row. So that's that tail that I weaved in backwards. I'm just going to grab it and stitch right over it. I don't know why this felt odd to me. I guess because I'm so used to crocheting over tails going the other direction, but it works exactly the same way when you go backwards over it. So that's just an easy way to weave in all of these tails. And also, if you get anything that kind of pokes out, these loops hide the tails pretty easily. So be mindful of that last stitch too. Weaving that tail in kind of pulls it tight, so you just want to open it up a little bit so you can maintain that last stitch. And always go back and recount your rows just to make sure you're not decreasing as you go along. So this is my sleeve at the end of row 32. So you see we have the cuff, we have the start of the sleeve, and then we have that opening. So just to visualize, this opening is kind of like the space where the sleeve would normally attach to the body. So this sleeve is making a line right at the top of the arm or at the top of the shoulder. And if you can visualize this wrapping around your arm, we need to fill in this space at the very top of the shoulder, this horseshoe shape. So I drew a diagram of our 42 stitches in that horseshoe shape, just to get a better idea of how these stitches will work for filling in. And you can refer back to this slide if you need to as we go along. I'm going to walk you through each row of this shoulder section. So row 1, we start by skipping 16 stitches. In that 17th stitch, we are going to slip stitch to attach our yarn. Now I'm going to skip the next stitch and I'm going to work in the stitch after that to create my double crochet loop stitch. So that's the first one. We're going to do a total of 6 double crochet loop stitches. Now, as we finish those 6 stitches, we're going to skip the next one and we are going to slip stitch into the stitch after that. This should leave the last 16 stitches of that row unworked. And just like we did on the previous rows, we will need to cut off our yarn and reattach for the next row. In row 2, we're going to skip 14 stitches this time and slip stitch into the 15th. Now you can also find the stitch to slip stitch into by just counting up by 2 stitches. When you slip stitch into the 15th, you're going to skip the next one and then start your double crochet loop stitches in the stitch after that, which is also the stitch that you slip stitched into on the previous row. Now I'm going to do 8 double crochet loop stitches across on this one. And this is just creating that increase on this row so that we can get our horseshoe shape. And remember, you got to catch that last stitch that you slip stitched into. So that's how you can be mindful of where your next stitch needs to go. And then of course we skip a stitch, slip stitch in the next one, and that should leave 14 stitches unworked. Make sure you count it before you trim off. All right, moving to row 3, we are going to skip 12 stitches this time and slip stitch into the 13th. We'll skip a stitch and do 10 double crochet loop stitches this time. This section isn't sped up a whole lot, but it is sped up. So if you need to slow it down just to be able to catch exactly where I'm stitching into, feel free to do that. I try to show everything but not take up too much time. So after our 10th double crochet loop stitch, we're going to skip a stitch, slip stitch into the next, and this should leave 12 stitches unworked. Make sure you do your double count before you tie off. Row 4, we're skipping 10 stitches. This time I just counted up 2, but I'm still going to double count. So we're skipping 10 stitches and slip stitching into the 11th to attach. We're going to skip the next stitch and start our double crochet loop stitches in the stitch after that. We should have a total of 12 double crochet loop stitches on this row. All right, and after our 12th double crochet loop stitch, we're going to skip a stitch, slip stitch into the next, and that should leave 10 stitches unworked. Row 5, we skip 8 stitches, slip stitch into the 9th, skip a stitch, and then work 14 double crochet loop stitches across. And then once you make that 14th loop, of course, you're going to skip the next stitch, slip stitch into the one after that, and this should leave 8 stitches unworked. Now, just taking a look over our work so far, that was the last row where we're going to increase our stitches. Now we just want to go straight across. In row 6, we're going to skip the first 6 stitches and slip stitch into the 7th in order to join. Now we're still skipping a stitch, but we're also skipping that one that we slipped into. And we're just going to double crochet loop on top of our last row of double crochet loops. So we're doing the same 14 double crochet loops on this row as well. You can kind of see how it's lining up where the side is pulling up parallel to our stitches. But when you pull on your tail too, that helps to close that little space there in between. And after we've done our 14 double crochets, we still want to count up 2, slip stitch, and then leave 6 stitches unworked on the end. Now I have a lot of tails on the end. You are going to have to weave these in because I didn't have a way to stitch over those. Row 7, we're only skipping 4 stitches, and then we're going to slip stitch into the 5th. We are still doing only 14 double crochet loop stitches on this one. So going just straight into the top of the last row. And then after our 14th, we are going to skip that stitch and slip stitch into the next one and leave 4 stitches unworked. Leave 4 stitches unworked. I don't know what I was just counting, but so that is how we get our shoulder filled in. So we're going to leave those 4 stitches on each side unworked, and those are going to attach to our neckline. And then we have our 14 stitches across the shoulder that are also going to attach to the neckline. So it kind of fits in. And now that you're done with your sleeve, you want to repeat parts 1 through 4 to make a second sleeve. All right, part 5 is our turtleneck, and we're at the home stretch now. The turtleneck is made exactly how we made our cuffs with that half double crochet rib stitch. But for the turtleneck, to make that one a little longer, we're going to do 26 foundation half double crochets in order to start our row. And of course, just like we did on the cuff, when you get to that end of that row, you're going to chain 1 and turn to go into your second row. My 26 foundation half doubles ends up being about 8.5, 8.25 inches. Row 2 is the same pattern as before. We are going to do 26 back loop half double crochets all the way across. And when you finish off those back loop half doubles, you're just going to chain 1 and turn your work. And then we are going to repeat this pattern for rows 3 through 32. And at the end of those rows, I end up with just about 14.5 inches. We're going to seam our turtleneck the same way we did the cuff. I just chained up 1 and turned my work like I'm working a new row, but I'm going to slip stitch into the back loop of row 32 and in through both loops of our foundation row. And we're going to join that with a slip stitch all the way across. Now I had already cut my yarn, so I'm just going to go ahead and finish off that row. But if you're still attached, it's perfectly fine. You can just chain up 1 to start the edge. Now for our turtleneck, I want to do a single crochet all the way around, but I want to make it evenly spaced. So this is a little different than we did on the cuff. I am going to put 1 stitch into the ridge, but then I'm going to put 1 stitch in the space in between ridges as well. That way I can keep them evenly spaced. So keep in mind we did 32 rows to make our turtleneck. So we're going to put 1 in the ridge, 1 in the space. That should still be 2 stitches per row since we're going on the side of those rows. So we should end up with a total of 64 stitches evenly spaced around this turtleneck. As you finish up your single crochet edging, you want to make sure that you are skipping that seam and not counting that as a stitch. And of course, before you tie off your yarn, you want to double check your count to make sure you have the correct amount of stitches in there. Your stitch count is going to be really important when it comes time to attach the neckline onto your sleeves. And once you've verified your count, you can go ahead and slip stitch into your first single crochet to finish that row off. And this is how our turtleneck looks once we roll it over. Remember, you're going to keep that seam on the outside because of this rollover. So our last section is part 5. This is where we're attaching that neck onto our sleeves. So remember, on our sleeves, we had the 14 stitches across, and then we had 4 on each side that we're skipping. Well, we're going to count the corner stitch as a stitch as well. So that's going to give us a total of 24 stitches on our sleeves. So running down those numbers, we have 64 stitches going around our neckline. We're using 48 of those stitches for our 2 sleeves. So this is going to leave 16 stitches free. That's going to be 8 in the front and 8 in the back. So we need to mark our stitches. And this is going to help us know where we need to attach our yarn. Since we're skipping 8 stitches, we're going to count over 4 from our seam and put a stitch marker into the 5th. That tells us where to start attaching our sleeve. We want to count over the 24 stitches and put another stitch marker in there so that we know where our sleeve should end. Now I'm skipping the next 8 stitches. That'll be our section in the front. And then I'll put another stitch marker in to mark the beginning of the next sleeve, count over 24 stitches, and our last stitch marker should mark the end of that sleeve and should also leave us with 4 stitches free to count up the 8 in the back. So I want to flip my work inside out so that my seam is on the inside of my project. So flip both your sleeve and your turtleneck. Now you can attach this by sewing it together, but I am going to single crochet across to attach both of my pieces together. So just inserting my hook and attaching my yarn where I had my stitch marker. And then I'm going to line up my stitches and single crochet through both the sleeve and the neckline to seam those together. And this is that corner stitch on our sleeve. So you don't want to skip that because it's going to leave a gap if you skip over it. Once I'm done attaching my sleeve to my neckline, I can go ahead and chain up one and detach my yarn. And I'm just reevaluating the sleeve section where I did the cap on the top. Some of the spacings were a little gappy, so I just kind of used the tails that were left over to pull some of my spaces together before I weave everything in. And of course, we're going to repeat this whole process on the other side, starting with our stitch markers to reattach our other sleeve, but you're going to go across the exact same way. And once we're done attaching the sleeves, this is what we have. You're going to take out all of your stitch markers and flip your project back on the right side. Of course, there's some tails left over that need to be weaved in or cut off. And then flip your turtleneck over. And this is our finished Loopy Crochet Ultra Crop Sweater. And of course, it looks a lot better on. So I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. Hit that notification bell because I'll be back with some more videos. Thanks for hanging in there, and thanks for watching SC4 Crochet.